In the heart of the Iranian plateau, where the Zagros Mountains rise like an eternal wall against the breath of the west wind, a girl was born into the lineage of fire and conquest. Her name was Atossa, and though history would come to remember her in fragments, buried beneath the names of kings and the weight of empires, hers was a story etched into the very foundation of the Achaemenid world. She was not just a daughter of Cyrus the Great. She was the daughter of the empire itself. Cyrus, the architect of a new world order, had carved from tribal fragmentation a realm that spanned from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus. He had broken the Median yoke, humbled Babylon, and embraced civilizations as diverse as Lydia and Elam. But in the quiet chambers of the royal citadel at Pasargadae, it was Atossa who would inherit something rarer than land. She would inherit the vision, the burden, and the bloodline. She was born during a moment of triumph. Her father's banners flew over conquered cities, and the world looked east in astonishment at the rise of a power that moved not as a horde, but as a civilization. From the moment she could walk, Atossa moved among corridors where languages intertwined, where emissaries from Egypt and India bowed before her father's throne. She heard prayers in Akkadian, whispers in Aramaic, and commands in Old Persian. Her world was not merely vast. It was complicated, ordered, and held together by the will of one man. Yet even as a child, she understood that the will of men was never eternal. Her mother, Cassandane, of noble lineage and devout in the old faith, taught her that empires could be beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Cassandane died young, and her absence left a silence that echoed in Atossa's bones. From that void grew a resolve, a knowing, that she would not simply be a pawn in a palace but a force behind its walls. As Cyrus turned his gaze toward the east, toward the wild lands of Sogdiana and Bactria, Atossa remained in Susa, where the royal court grew into a miniature world of diplomacy and intrigue. She studied languages not out of obligation, but out of necessity. She learned that power whispered long before it roared. The eunuchs of the court feared her silence more than any tantrum. The scribes marveled at her questions. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried weight beyond her years. When news came of Cyrus's death in battle, struck down by the queen of the Massagetæ in the far steppes, it was not just a father who had died, but an order. The great engine of the Achaemenid Empire trembled. His body was returned to Pasargadae, laid to rest in a tomb he had built for himself long before the final campaign. The stone was simple, almost humble, but inside was the silence of 1,000 victories. Atossa, barely into adulthood, wept not only for the man but for the question his death unleashed. Who would hold the empire together? Her brother Cambyses ascended to the throne, a man more sword than mind, more fear than vision. He took her hand in marriage, a move steeped in tradition and legality, a union not of love but of continuity. For Atossa, it was a bitter seal on her bloodline, binding her to a man who had inherited their father's power but none of his soul. Cambyses ruled with violence, burning bridges that Cyrus had built with care. His campaign into Egypt began with promise and ended in dread. In Memphis, Cambyses desecrated temples, killed priests, and mocked the gods of the Nile. Far from the royal heartland, Atossa's name was forgotten in the dust of conquest. Yet she remained watchful. Reports from the satraps reached her ears, and she began to note a pattern: discontent, revolt, and the fracturing of alliances. The empire was vast, but it was brittle. Without Cyrus's guiding hand, the Achaemenid structure was beginning to crack. Then came the whispers. Bardia, also known as Smyrdes, the other son of Cyrus, long thought to be dead, had returned. Or someone claiming to be him. From Ecbatana to Persepolis, cities began to proclaim allegiance to this mysterious figure. Cambyses, marching back from Egypt in a fury, died en route, by blade or accident. No one could say with certainty. In the chaos that followed, the false Bardia took the throne. To the people, he promised relief from taxes, rest from war, and a return to justice. But to those who had seen the real Bardia, there was unease. He never left his chambers. He issued decrees behind curtains. His voice was known, but his face was hidden. Atossa watched this drama unfold from the confines of the palace. She said nothing, not even when the false king sent gifts and flattery. She observed. She remembered the shape of her brother's voice, the patterns of his gait. The man on the throne was not her brother, but she understood the peril of accusation without proof. She also understood that the empire, already bleeding, could not afford another fracture. Then came Darius. He was not of the royal line, but he was of the blood. A cousin, a commander, a man forged in war and polished by court politics. With a cadre of 6 other nobles, he stormed the palace and killed the usurper. His justification would be carved into stone at Behistun, told in 3 tongues, spread across the empire like scripture. He was the restorer, the righteous hand, the chosen of Ahura Mazda. But even righteous hands tremble. Darius had killed a king and seized a throne. He had legitimacy in action but not in birth. That is where Atossa entered history again. Not as widow, not as sister, but as queen. Their marriage was more than symbolic. In taking Atossa, Darius did not just bind himself to Cyrus's legacy. He inherited it. She became the thread that stitched 2 dynasties into one seamless garment. Within the newly stabilized court, Atossa's presence was undeniable. She wore no crown of state, issued no royal edicts, but she was the axis around which the new empire rotated. She urged him to see the empire not as a battlefield, but as a body. Roads were its veins, laws its bones, trade its breath. She showed him that an empire built on fear would collapse under its own weight, but one built on order could endure beyond memory. Darius listened, not blindly, not submissively, but attentively. When his rule would face rebellion, war, and the scorn of Greek chroniclers, it would be Atossa's early counsel that guided him. When he began to draft the administrative reforms that would define his reign, satrapies, codified taxation, centralized authority, it was the echoes of Atossa's voice he followed. In public, she remained elusive. In private, she was ever present. Where Darius signed laws, Atossa had already debated them. Where Darius built cities, Atossa had envisioned their purpose. But she was the breath behind the flame, the shadow that kept the light alive, and the one who knew from the moment of her birth that to be born into empire was to shape it, or be consumed by it. And she had chosen to shape it. The empire that Cyrus the Great had built was still vast, still breathing, but after his death, its rhythm had changed. It no longer marched to the steady beat of vision and ambition. It stumbled, and as it stumbled, Atossa watched from the inner sanctum of power, her presence a quiet constant among the ever-shifting faces of satraps, generals, and priests. The Achaemenid Empire had not fallen, but it was no longer ascending. It was waiting for a new anchor, a new compass, a new heart. Cambyses II, Atossa's brother and now her husband, sat upon the throne with the fire of their father but not the mind. Where Cyrus had ruled with both strength and benevolence, Cambyses ruled with suspicion and rage. The shadows lengthened under his reign, cast not by the sun of progress but by the fire of fear. He had inherited a world that required harmony to survive, always past. But Cambyses was not merely a storm. He was erosion, slowly wearing down the structures his father had erected with care. His campaign into Egypt began with ceremonial grandeur. But what began as conquest turned to desecration. Temples were looted. Sacred statues were defiled. Cambyses mocked the gods of the Nile and executed their priests with cold disdain. He saw Egypt not as a jewel to be set within the crown of the empire but as a conquest to be broken and made to kneel. The news reached Atossa in fragments. A letter from a satrap, a whisper from a merchant, the silence of officials who had once spoken freely. She pieced together the truth not from proclamations, but from absences. And she saw in those absences the decay that would soon reach the heart of the empire. Back in the core lands, revolts began to simmer. The Elamites grew restless. The Babylonians remembered their independence. The Medes grumbled beneath their gilded chains. Cambyses was far away, and in his absence, the myth of invincibility began to crack. But it was not until the appearance of a man calling himself Bardia that the illusion shattered. This man claimed to be Atossa's brother, long believed murdered in secret by Cambyses. His voice was soft, his policies generous, and his appearance carefully guarded. He reduced taxes. He ended conscriptions. He promised justice. The people, weary of Cambyses' tyranny, welcomed him. But the mask had power now. It had armies, scribes, and the collective hope of a weary empire behind it. Cambyses, hearing of this revolt, turned his army back from Egypt. But he would never reach Persia again. Somewhere in the deserts of Syria he died. Perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, perhaps by his own hand. His death removed one tyrant, but left the throne to a ghost. The false Bardia ruled briefly but effectively. He issued proclamations from behind curtains, never appearing in public. His edicts were fair. It was then that 7 nobles rose, men of high lineage and ambition, among them Darius, the son of Hystaspes, a distant cousin of the royal line and a former spear-bearer to Cambyses. Together, in a coordinated strike that would echo across time, they stormed the palace and killed the usurper. Whether the man was truly Bardia or not no longer mattered. He had been removed. Order, such as it was, had been restored. But restoring order is not the same as establishing legitimacy. The nobles had acted in haste, out of fear, yet to many he was a usurper of a usurper, a soldier cloaked in ambition. It was in this precarious moment that Atossa became the key. Her marriage to Darius was swift, almost symbolic. But in that union was the legitimacy Darius lacked. She was Cyrus's daughter, the embodiment of dynastic continuity. Through her, Darius did not merely rule, he inherited. Atossa understood the weight of this arrangement. She could have resisted. She could have retreated into silence or become a figurehead. But she chose instead to engage. She saw in Darius not a brute, but a builder. Not a tyrant, but a tactician. He was no Cyrus, but he was something else. A man who understood the machinery of empire, who could take the shattered pieces of power and reassemble them into something even greater. In the early months of Darius's reign, rebellion flared across the empire. Elam, Media, Babylon, and Egypt all rose, believing the empire fractured beyond repair. It was a test, not only of Darius's resolve, but of the new partnership that had been formed in silence. While Darius rode to war, Atossa remained in Susa, but her role was not idle. She maintained correspondence. She received emissaries. She reassured allies. Her name, placed alongside Darius's in royal missives, she ensured that conquered provinces were not only subdued but reintegrated. She advised moderation where vengeance was demanded. She reminded her husband that the strength of an empire was not in the number of enemies it killed, but in the number of peoples it united. And slowly the empire bent back into shape. By the end of Darius's second year, the rebellions were extinguished, the provinces pacified, and a new order began to emerge. The people of Persia saw in Darius a king who could act. But those who understood power more deeply saw the quiet figure beside the throne, the woman whose lineage had saved the crown, whose judgment had steadied the empire. Atossa, now firmly queen of queens, began to recede from public view, but not from influence. Her work was just beginning. The empire was not yet whole. Its body had been mended, but its soul still flickered. She would ensure that the flame did not die. She had buried her father, endured her brother, survived a usurper, and now stood beside a man whose future was being written in fire and stone. And in the silence of the royal court, as the scribes etched Darius's proclamations and the architects laid the foundation of cities yet to rise, the palace of Susa gleamed in the rising sun, its polished columns and intricate reliefs casting long shadows across the polished floors. But behind the splendor was a tension that no artisan's hand could soften. An empire, barely healed from rebellion, stood on fragile legs. Outside the walls, In the satrapies that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, there was quiet. But it was a quiet born of exhaustion, not loyalty. Rebellion had been crushed. There was one figure who did not speak often, yet whose very presence changed the atmosphere of a room. Atossa, now Queen of Queens, had become more than a wife. She was the key that turned a claim into legitimacy. The daughter of Cyrus, the widow of Cambyses, and now the consort of Darius, her bloodline wrapped around the very heart of the Achaemenid dynasty. To many, she was a symbol of continuity. To others, a dangerous wildcard. To Darius, she was both anchor and compass. Their union had begun in political necessity. When Darius seized the throne, he had the backing of noble families and military power, but what he lacked was a direct tie to the founding line. By marrying Atossa, he gained more than royal legitimacy. He gained the narrative. He was no longer merely the man who had slain a pretender. He became the protector of Cyrus's legacy. But Atossa had not entered the marriage blindly, nor had she been forced into it. She had seen in Darius a potential no one else had. His mind was structured, his ambitions vast, but most importantly, he listened. But as sovereigns bound by understanding, Darius, in the early years of his rule, set out to consolidate power not just with armies, but with systems. He redrew the map of the empire into satrapies, administrative districts ruled by governors accountable to the throne. He codified tax laws, organized records, standardized weights and measures. In a realm as diverse as Persia, such coherence had never existed. But such reforms did not arise in a vacuum. They were not the product of a solitary mind but of collaboration. In the quiet hours between court sessions and ceremonies, Atossa sat with Darius among scrolls and ledgers, maps and reports. She did not command, but she questioned. She did not propose, but she refined. She knew the empire as few did. From her childhood beside Cyrus, she had learned the value of inclusion, of allowing cultures to retain their forms even under Persian rule. From Cambyses, she had learned the dangers of domination without comprehension. Now, with Darius, she forged a middle path. When the question of religious tolerance arose, whether to impose the tenets of Zoroastrianism across all lands, Atossa counseled restraint. Let the Greeks pray to their pantheon. The King of Kings need not be worshipped to be obeyed. Darius adopted this vision. His inscriptions praised Ahura Mazda, began to pulse as a single body with many voices but one rhythm. Behind this rhythm, Atossa moved like a conductor without baton. Within the court, she began to assert influence not through proclamations, but through relationships. She mentored younger royal women, taught them diplomacy, ensured their marriages served the state. She remained a figure of mystery. She did not seek public adoration. Her image was not cast in gold. But her name, when whispered in court halls, carried weight. She was the queen who had survived dynastic collapse, the widow who had watched kings fall, the woman who now stood beside one determined not to repeat those failures. The tension between Darius's past as a soldier and his present as a sovereign never fully disappeared. He had been a warrior before he became a king, and the urge to conquer remained strong. He began to speak of expanding westward, of crossing the Aegean, of punishing the Greek city-states who had supported rebellion in Ionia. Atossa listened. She said little at first, but one evening, as Darius spread maps across the stone table and traced the outlines of potential campaigns, she placed her hand over a region not yet touched, Thrace, beyond the Hellespont. She asked only one question: "Can you govern what you do not understand?" It was not a rebuke. It was a reminder that the empire's greatest strength was not in its ability to conquer, but in its ability to endure. Darius considered her words. He did not abandon his plans, but he began to send envoys before soldiers. He sought intelligence before domination. And when conflict did come, as it inevitably would, it came with preparation. Together, Atossa and Darius shaped not just the boundaries of an empire, but its character. In the city of Persepolis, a new capital began to rise, built not merely as a seat of power, but as a symbol of unity. Architects and artisans from across the empire worked side by side, Babylonian brickmakers, Ionian sculptors, Median engineers. Atossa took a personal interest in its design. She ensured that the reliefs depicted not only Persian victories, but the presence of every people within the empire, each delegation carved in dignity. The vision was clear. The Achaemenid Empire was not a realm of subjugation, but of synthesis. And through it all, Atossa's influence deepened. She bore children for Darius, among them Xerxes, the future heir. But even in motherhood, she remained political. She understood that blood alone did not secure succession. Position, perception, and planning were essential. She began to shape not just her sons' upbringing, but their image. The court watched, some with admiration, others with suspicion. A queen so visible in governance, so central to succession, was an anomaly, but no one could deny her effectiveness. Atossa had become more than queen. She was the embodiment of imperial wisdom, and Darius, the so-called usurper, had become a king whose legitimacy now rested not only on his victories, but on the queen who stood beside him. Together, they were not merely rulers. They were architects of permanence. By the time Darius had settled the final embers of revolt and turned his gaze inward, the empire was no longer a fractured inheritance but a canvas awaiting order. What had been seized in fire now needed to be shaped by principle. Yet behind every law codified and every border drawn, there remained the silent memory of how quickly empires could dissolve, of how even the might of Cyrus had nearly slipped into ruin after his death. It was not enough to rule. The empire had to be made unbreakable. Darius understood this. So did Atossa. She had walked through the corridors of Pasargadae when her father's voice still echoed off stone. She had watched Cambyses burn bridges in Egypt and knew the faces of satraps who once wore loyalty like a veil. And she had seen how easily the world shifted when power was uncertain. It was not enough for Darius to be king. He needed to be emperor in form, in function, in permanence. And she would ensure he became exactly that. From Susa to Persepolis, from Babylon to Sardis, the empire buzzed with activity. Roads were paved over ancient caravan trails. Messages traveled faster than armies. Tax collectors began to appear not as raiders but as bureaucrats. For the first time, a standardized system of tribute was introduced across all satrapies, calculated, balanced, enforceable. Gone were the arbitrary levies imposed by local governors. In their place came an imperial ledger, etched in clay and ink, monitored from the royal heart. Atossa watched the numbers flow in like rivers toward a sea. She saw not only what the empire produced, but what it consumed. Wheat from Egypt, wool from Lydia, spices from the east, lumber from Phoenicia. Each tributary became a testimony to Persia's unity. And behind every figure lay a human story, a scribe calculating value, a satrap balancing ambition and obedience, a subject paying in coin or kind. Empire was not grandeur. It was arithmetic. Atossa understood this better than most. But structure without narrative is hollow. And so, with Darius's reforms came inscriptions, monuments of meaning. The most famous would be carved high into a cliff at Behistun, where the king's own version of history would be displayed in 3 tongues, like a decree from the gods. It told the story of a righteous man who had removed a pretender, who had restored truth, who had been chosen by Ahura Mazda. There were no mentions of uncertainty, no notes of Atossa's counsel, no traces of the fragile negotiations that preceded the sword. She did not mind. Atossa understood that the truth of empire often lay not in what was written, but in what endured. While the world saw Darius's public face, she helped sculpt the invisible skeleton. She refined court protocol, selecting how envoys were received and what rituals accompanied the New Year ceremonies. She ensured the palace hierarchy functioned like a clock, predictable, stable, symbolic. The empire did not just need power. It needed performance. One of her greatest contributions was shaping the role of the satraps themselves. Darius had created them as governors, administrators loyal to the king. But Atossa saw the risk. What happened when governors saw themselves as princes? She quietly began to advise the palace to rotate certain appointments, to maintain oversight through secret envoys, and to invest in scribes trained in loyalty as much as literacy. These scribes, often eunuchs or commoners, would be placed strategically across the empire, but as a system of organs feeding a central heart. And as it grew in stability, it grew in vision. Atossa played a role in shaping the grand urban projects that came to define the Achaemenid presence. In Persepolis, a city rose like an idea made stone. Massive terraces were carved into the mountainside. Halls of columns reached toward the heavens. Reliefs depicted processions of all the peoples of the empire. Medes, Elamites, Indians, Egyptians, each carved with dignity, bearing tribute, not shackles. Atossa had insisted on this. The empire spoke without words. This is a realm of many nations, bound by a common will. Atossa's fingerprints were everywhere, in architecture, in ritual, in tone. She advised Darius on the foundation of new legal standards, ones that acknowledged local custom while harmonizing principles across the empire. Each satrapy could retain its laws, but imperial judges, trained in both state doctrine and regional traditions, would serve as intermediaries. Justice would not be uniform, but it would be consistent. Mercy would not be weakness, but wisdom. She knew that in such a diverse realm, force could not maintain order forever. But structure, clarity, and the illusion of choice could. In this, she was not merely preserving Cyrus's vision, she was improving upon it. But power always drew jealousy, and Atossa's influence did not go unnoticed. Within the court, other wives of Darius watched as Atossa's sons were favored, as her voice carried into decisions beyond the harem. Noble families, once close to Cambyses, whispered that she held too much sway. She strengthened her alliances through marriages arranged for nieces and nephews, through gifts sent to satrapal wives, through gestures as small as a new robe in the right color, gifted at the right time. She did not command armies, but she conquered allegiance. All the while, Darius came to rely more on her. He would later write in inscriptions of his greatness, of his divine favor, of his victories, but he never wrote of his dependence. That was a truth kept behind the curtain. And yet it was known. In every royal procession, Atossa rode not behind Darius, but beside him. In every festival, her name was spoken with reverence. And in every corner of the empire, scribes recorded edicts that bore not just the seal of the King of Kings, but the approval of the Queen of Blood. Together, they reforged the crown, not just as a symbol of personal rule, but as a concept of empire itself. The Achaemenid realm was no longer the extension of a single man's will. It was an organism self-sustaining, self-correcting, designed to outlast its creators. And as the borders stabilized, as the roads grew thick with merchants, as temples rose in cities that once rebelled, Atossa began to look further, beyond mere rule toward legacy. She had brought order from ashes. Now she would turn her gaze to the question that haunted all who ruled. Who comes next? The empire no longer bled from its borders. The rebellions had been extinguished. The satrapies now hummed with regulated tribute, and the names of distant cities, Sardis, Bactra, Memphis, no longer carried the flavor of threat, but of administration. Darius had done what few rulers had achieved. He had stopped the bleeding. But Atossa understood that stopping the bleeding was not the same as ensuring life. The body of empire needed more than bones of law and muscles of military. It needed veins. It needed breath. It needed memory. She saw it first in the slowness of news. Months passed between a satrap's crime and the king's reprimand. Merchants delayed trade over inconsistent weights. Messengers took wrong roads and arrived with dusty tongues and blunted truths. The empire was large but not yet connected. And so, with Darius's consent, she helped shape one of the greatest circulatory systems the world had ever seen, the Royal Road. Stretching nearly 1,700 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, the Royal Road was more than stone and dirt. It was a declaration, a line of authority drawn across the wilderness. Relay stations were established at intervals, stocked with horses, food, scribes, and protection. Messages could now fly from one end of the empire to the other in mere days instead of months. For the first time in history, governance could keep pace with ambition. Atossa took a special interest in its efficiency. She ordered her personal stewards to test the road in secret. She tracked the speed of missives sent under aliases, measured the freshness of supplies at way stations, demanded reports on the demeanor of station masters. The road bore the king's name, but it pulsed with her scrutiny. Yet movement without meaning was useless. And so, even as couriers galloped across the empire, Atossa turned to another challenge: memory. A realm this vast, she realized, would not survive on force alone. It required story, not the fleeting breath of oral legends, but the permanence of ink. In every major satrapal center, she encouraged the establishment of archival rooms. Clay tablets and parchment scrolls were copied and preserved. Tax records, land disputes, treaties, harvest yields, births, deaths, life itself was recorded. These archives did not serve curiosity. They served continuity. In them, law had memory, decisions had precedent, and power had a lineage. Atossa understood the danger of forgetting. She had seen how easily names were erased, how quickly a ruler's actions were twisted by rumor or rebellion. She pushed for royal decrees to be issued in multiple languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic. The empire could not be ruled through a single tongue. To be understood was to endure. It was not a new army. It was a new brain. Darius recognized the value. His inscriptions began to reference the act of recording as divine. Ahura Mazda favored truth, and truth required record. But behind the grandeur of marble proclamations stood Atossa's vision: a state that could see itself, remember itself, and correct itself. Even culture became part of the machinery. But subjects in procession, each ethnicity rendered with care, each detail authentic. It was art as policy, a visual reminder that diversity was not tolerated. It was foundational. Atossa also turned her gaze to education. The sons of nobles were brought to Susa and Persepolis, trained not only in arms but in administration, philosophy, and languages. A future satrap could not simply be brave. He had to be literate. Governance, she knew, required more than loyalty. It required literacy of the soul. From within the palace, she launched quiet reforms that reverberated for generations. Widows were granted rights to property. Merchant guilds were given charters. Religious leaders of minority faiths received protection, so long as they swore fidelity to the empire. These were not dramatic declarations. They were clauses tucked within edicts, amendments whispered into law, but they changed lives. Trade, too, flourished under this new order. The roadways became arteries not only of power, but of profit. Caravans moved silk, incense, tin, and lapis. Markets in Sardis displayed textiles from India. She established regional councils, groups of elders, merchants, scribes, and priests, tasked with reporting directly to the central court on local affairs. These councils had no army. She remained almost invisible to the public. Her name rarely adorned monuments. Her face was not etched into coin. But within the court, her silence spoke louder than any proclamation. She was the one who turned the dream of empire into a living, breathing organism. It was around this time that she began to consider the deeper legacy of their rule. Not simply what would be built. His wisdom was not a relic. It was precedent. And yet, she knew that the future did not rest on memory alone. It required succession. Her sons grew quickly. Among them, Xerxes stood out not for strength but for clarity. He was observant, sharp, and patient. She began to mold him not in ambition, but in capacity. She surrounded him with tutors of varied origin. Her goal was not to create a ruler in her image. It was to create a ruler capable of seeing beyond himself. As the empire grew in confidence, Darius began to speak more openly of Western ambitions. But she reminded him that expansion without internal readiness was a trap. In preparation, she oversaw the expansion of the royal road into new territories, the establishment of naval bases, the stockpiling of supplies. If war was to come, she would ensure it did not consume the empire's foundations. In the eyes of many, the empire had reached its zenith. But Atossa knew better, chronicled its rhythms, and now prepared it for a new era. Not with swords, not with noise, but with roads and scrolls. As the empire's roads stretched across deserts and mountains, and as scrolls filled the vaults of cities from Sardis to Susa, it was something more elemental, more intimate. Faith. Fire burned in the temples of Zoroaster. Not fire as destruction, but fire as truth. The sacred flame that never extinguished, the eternal symbol of Asha, order, justice, the righteous path. Atossa had grown up in its glow, in temples where priests whispered hymns that spoke of the cosmic battle between good and evil, light and darkness, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. It was not merely religion, it was worldview, a lens through which power could be defined, justified, and controlled. Cyrus had ruled with open palms, allowing temples to flourish and local cults to persist. But as Atossa watched the machinery of empire take form, she understood that political cohesion required more than shared law or common roads. It needed a moral language, a spiritual grammar that could bind tribes and tongues to the same axis. Darius, too, saw the value in the fire. In his inscriptions, he declared Ahura Mazda the source of his kingship, the giver of order. But the theology was not yet fixed. The rituals varied. She began in silence, as she always did. She brought priests from the eastern lands of Chorasmia and Bactria to the court, men who had kept older, purer traditions alive, closer to the teachings of Zoroaster himself. She listened to their interpretations of the Gathas, the sacred hymns. She compared them to the ceremonies of the court fire temples. She catalogued their differences not to erase, but to unify. It was Atossa who advised the creation of a centralized Magian council, a body of high priests who would codify the rituals, establish canonical prayer cycles, and ensure doctrinal coherence across the empire. It was she who saw the importance of fire temples not just as places of worship, but as local centers of education, dispute resolution, and imperial ideology. Wherever the flame burned, it whispered not just of gods, but of order, law, and duty to the King of Kings. She understood, more than anyone, that religion could be more than belief, it could be infrastructure. The temples became nodes of alignment, spiritual equivalents to the royal roads. They taught the values that underpinned Persian law: honesty, loyalty, purity of thought, word, and deed. From the lowliest farmer to the grandest satrap, a place within the imperial mission. Atossa's influence permeated this shift, even if her name never appeared on tablets or decrees. She did not seek to impose doctrine. Instead, she harmonized it one province at a time. And as the faith gained structure, so too did its place in the empire. Darius began to link his policies to Zoroastrian principles. Corruption was no longer just a political failure, it was a spiritual danger. Disloyalty to the throne became a turning toward the lie, a sin against Ahura Mazda. Taxation was framed as a moral duty. Obedience was righteousness. Empire became not only law and administration, but divine mission. Atossa's hands were on every layer of this transformation. She commissioned the copying of sacred texts, not only in Avestan script but also in Aramaic and Elamite, ensuring accessibility across cultures. She funded the training of female temple educators in regions where male priests were mistrusted. She supported reforms that allowed local traditions, so long as they did not contradict imperial truth, to coexist with the central fire. In doing so, court physicians began to reference the balance of the elements, guided by religious principles. Even architecture followed suit. New buildings aligned with cardinal directions. She remembered Cambyses and the desecration in Egypt. She remembered how easily power cloaked in righteousness could slip into tyranny. She ensured that the empire would not fall victim to its own piety. The balance was delicate, but she maintained it, because she knew what the stakes were. To Atossa, religion was not a tool, it was a river. Could nourish, but it could also flood. And she had sworn that her empire would not drown. Beyond the political center, she refrained from pushing doctrine, instead supporting local priests who swore allegiance to the King of Kings. In the mountains of Armenia, she sent emissaries not to convert, but to translate, to explain the empire's moral foundation in terms that locals could accept. And among the people, her reputation grew, not as a priestess, but as a protector. In villages along the royal road, families whispered blessings in her name. In fire temples near the Caspian, her likeness appeared in tapestry, not in royal robes, but in simple attire, hand extended toward the flame. She became more than queen. She became matron of the moral order. Within the royal family, this spiritual structure became personal. Her sons were raised in Zoroastrian discipline. Xerxes especially took to the teachings. Atossa guided his education, ensuring that he understood not just the words of the hymns, but their implications for power. He came to see kingship not merely as rule over land, but as stewardship of truth. It was Atossa's greatest success, and her greatest gamble. For faith, once ignited, has a life of its own. Darius, now in the full strength of his reign, declared Zoroastrianism the guiding philosophy of the court. He stopped short of banning other religions, but he made it clear, the empire had a soul, and that soul burned with fire. Atossa stood beside him at festivals, cloaked in white and gold, holding the sacred bundle of twigs during purification rites. Her presence was no longer symbolic. It was sanctified, but in private she began to reflect. Faith had given the empire coherence, stability, vision. Yet it also brought rigidity. Dissenting voices grew quieter, and when they did speak, they did so in fear. Atossa knew that even righteousness could become tyranny if left unchecked. She instructed her scribes to preserve dissenting opinions in the royal archive. She commissioned court poets to write of the complexity of divine justice, not just its certainty. She reminded Darius that Ahura Mazda's greatest gift was not obedience. It was choice. The fire still burned, but Atossa made sure it burned with humility. The empire, now anchored in law, connected by roads, and lit by the fires of a unified faith, had reached a level of stability that few could have imagined in the chaotic aftermath of Cyrus's death. Darius reigned not only as king but as an administrator of time itself. He had tamed the calendar, measured the harvests, balanced tribute with mercy. And beside him, Atossa moved like a current beneath the stone, never loudly proclaimed but always present, always shaping. But peace is a plateau and empire is motion. And motion, by its very nature, seeks new frontiers. Darius, though content in his order, was never content with its limits. His gaze began to shift toward the west, beyond the bounds of the royal road, across the waters of the Aegean, toward a land of small cities, fierce independence, and infuriating disorder. The Greek world. The conflict had not begun with Darius. It had begun in Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor, cities with Greek blood but Persian governance. For years, these coastal outposts had been absorbed into the Achaemenid fold, administered by local tyrants loyal to the King of Kings. But the Greeks of the mainland, especially the Athenians, had a different vision. They encouraged revolt, sent ships and silver, and stoked a rebellion that lit a fire Darius could not ignore. The Ionian revolt, though crushed, had sent a message. The western edge of the empire was porous, not in defense but in ideology. The Greeks spoke of freedom, of individual valor, of democracy, not as philosophy alone but as a call to arms. They rejected hierarchy, refused tribute, and mocked the very idea of a God-chosen king. To Darius, this was not just rebellion. It was blasphemy. Atossa listened as the reports came in, not only of battles, but of rhetoric. Greek orators who denounced Persian kingship as tyranny. philosophers who questioned divine authority. She sensed the danger, not in the strength of their armies, but in the virus of their ideas. The empire, after all, was a construction of harmony. Many cultures, one order, but the Greeks offered dissonance as virtue. They weaponized disagreement. They glorified resistance, and they spread it like wildfire. Darius, ever methodical, began to plan. Not a raid, not a punitive expedition, but a campaign, a redefinition of the western edge. He would bring the Greeks into the empire not through negotiation, but through subjugation. He would make Athens kneel. Atossa watched him work, watched the maps unfold across stone tables, watched the commanders summoned and the ships prepared. But in her heart, she questioned the wisdom of such an undertaking. Not because she feared defeat. She had seen the empire survive worse, but because she saw no end to such a war. She understood something that few around her did, that the Greeks would not be pacified by structure. They would not be integrated by law or language. Their very identity was opposition. To conquer them was to court endless unrest. But she did not speak in opposition. That was not her way. Instead, she asked questions. How will our merchants cross their markets if their fields are burned? How will their poets sing our praise if their temples are destroyed? How will we administer a people who see obedience as betrayal? She offered not a barrier, but a mirror. Darius was not deaf to her concerns, but he was resolute. The insult had gone too far. The empire could not allow challenge to go unanswered. To ignore the Greeks was to invite chaos at every border. And so the decision was made. The campaign would proceed. Preparations began in earnest. A fleet was constructed with shipwrights from Phoenicia and Cyprus. An army was assembled from every satrapy: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Bactrians. It was not merely an expedition. It was a procession of empire, a demonstration that no city, no matter how proud, could stand against unity. Atossa played her role as she always did. She organized supplies. She coordinated correspondences between commanders. She ensured that the wives of generals received protection and favor in their husbands' absence. She was the hidden architect of the campaign's logistics. But as the fleet sailed toward the Aegean, she felt the shift. The empire was no longer building. It was extending, reaching, testing the limits of its own cohesion. The Battle of Marathon came swiftly and ended brutally. The Persian force, though vast, was repelled by the Athenian hoplites. The victory was as symbolic as it was strategic. The Greeks rejoiced, the Persians reeled, and the world watched. Darius, humiliated but undeterred, began preparations for a second campaign. But Atossa saw what he did not, that the war had already changed. It was no longer about Ionia. It was no longer about tribute or revenge. It was about identity. The Greeks had proven that a small, unified force fighting on principle could defeat an empire. And that principle would now spread like ink across parchment. Other regions would take notice. Other subjects would ask questions. She began to reassert her influence not in the war council, but in the home front. She refocused attention on internal reform. She called for the rebuilding of roads damaged by troop movements. She renewed patronage of local temples and festivals. She reminded the people, through subtle gestures, that the empire's strength was not only its reach, but its center. And in the private chambers of the palace, she began to speak to her sons. Xerxes, now of age, absorbed her words with the quiet patience that marked him. He saw the triumphs and the failures. He felt the weight of legacy on his shoulders. Atossa guided him not to hate the Greeks, but to understand them, not as barbarians, but as a challenge unlike any other. She knew that he would inherit a throne already entangled in war. And she began to prepare him not just as a warrior, but as a ruler who must navigate the thin line between vengeance and vision. Darius, worn from battle and time, turned inward. He spoke less of conquest and more of order. He returned to the cities, the courts, the rituals, and Atossa, ever near, reminded him of what they had built together. Not just a realm, but a rhythm. The war would not end with Marathon. But the shape of empire was changing. And Atossa, standing at the edge of two worlds, east and west, tradition and defiance, fire and stone, knew that the next chapter would not be written in victory, but in consequence. The winds off the Aegean carried more than salt and storm. They carried whispers of defiance, etched into the marble of Athens and the hills of Plataea. And within those whispers was a wound, deep, unexpected, and humiliating. The might of the Persian Empire had been met not with submission but with resolve. At Marathon, in a plain meant to bear witness to the inevitability of empire, the Greeks had done the unthinkable. They had stood, they had held, and they had pushed the great machine back into the sea. The news arrived at Susa like a gust of cold air slicing through silk curtains. The messengers, hardened and wind-burnt, brought not just words but a silence that followed them into every chamber. Darius listened to their report with the stillness of a mountain, but Atossa saw it in his hands, how they clenched not from anger, but from understanding. This was not just a tactical defeat. It was a rupture in the mythology of Persia's invincibility. The court reacted in waves. Some dismissed the loss as a temporary setback, a battlefield anomaly. Others blamed poor planning, treacherous weather, or the failure of satrapal coordination. A few, more astute, remained silent because they understood what Atossa understood. The defeat at Marathon had pierced the veil. For years, the empire had expanded with little resistance. Cities were absorbed, kings submitted, roads laid and temples built. Resistance had become symbolic, a ritual of opposition before assimilation. But the Greeks had broken that pattern. They had not merely resisted, they had survived. And in surviving, they had proven that the empire's reach could be blunted. Atossa, ever the observer, watched the court descend into a frenzy of reassessment. Advisors urged immediate retaliation. Generals demanded reorganization. Historians debated whether Marathon should even be acknowledged in official records. But Atossa knew that the deeper damage was not strategic. It was spiritual. Marathon had stripped away the illusion of omnipotence. It had shown that Persian power, though vast, was not omniscient. That a people could fight for something beyond gold, beyond territory, beyond even safety. They fought for the intangible freedom, identity, autonomy. Concepts that did not fit easily into tax ledgers or imperial edicts. Darius, to his credit, did not lash out blindly. He convened his council. He requested detailed reports. He summoned surviving commanders not to chastise them, but to understand. And yet, as Atossa observed, his resolve began to shift. The fire that once burned with vision now burned with vengeance. She feared this change. For decades, they had built an empire not merely on conquest, but on coherence. They had turned tribes into citizens, languages into law, and belief into binding force. But vengeance, she knew, was a poor architect. It destroyed far more than it built. And worse, it distracted. As the empire's attention turned westward again, Atossa worked to maintain the balance. She instructed her scribes to review provincial records, not for signs of rebellion, but for signs of neglect. She dispatched emissaries to satrapies whose governors had grown complacent. She increased funding for local festivals, reaffirming the cultural bonds that held the mosaic together. The empire could not afford to forget its soul while chasing a shadow across the sea. But even she could not stop what had begun. Darius ordered the construction of a new fleet, larger, better supplied, drawn not only from Phoenician ports but from new shipyards built along the Iranian coast. He reorganized the chain of command, ensuring that generals reported directly to him. And most significantly, he began to consider a succession plan, one that would ensure the continuation of this campaign beyond his own life. It was here that Atossa's influence took its most decisive turn. Among Darius's sons, there were many contenders, some born of noble women from powerful clans, others older, more experienced, with years of court politics behind them. But Atossa had long prepared her son Xerxes for this moment. She had shaped his education, tempered his pride, instilled in him a sense of duty that transcended bloodline. She did not plead for his right. She built the case. She reminded Darius, in private and through trusted intermediaries, that Xerxes carried both the blood of the Achaemenid line and the wisdom of experience. He had served as regent in his father's absence, governed satrapies with restraint, and most importantly, he understood the delicate machinery of empire. He had grown up within the logic of their creation. He was not just a prince. He was a reflection of the empire's ideals. Darius, torn between legacy and loyalty, deliberated for months. The court buzzed with speculation. Rival mothers schemed. Nobles aligned themselves cautiously. But in the end, the king made his choice. Xerxes would be heir. The announcement was not public at first. It circulated through channels of command, through palace scrolls and quiet nods. But its effect was immediate. Atossa's influence, long subtle, now became visible. She was not merely the mother of a prince. She was the mother of the future king. And yet, she took no victory lap. She did not celebrate, did not parade, because she knew the war was far from over. Even as Xerxes was elevated, Darius continued preparations for a second Greek expedition. He spoke less now of vision and more of restoration. The fire in his eyes was no longer the blaze of a builder. It was the simmering coal of a man who had been mocked. Atossa grew quieter. She focused her energy inward, on Xerxes's final education, on strengthening palace alliances, on ensuring that the reforms they had built would not unravel under the weight of military obsession. She knew that, if the Second War failed, the empire would survive. But if the empire lost its clarity, its internal balance, nothing would matter. Then came the illness. Darius, no longer young, began to falter. His health, once robust, declined rapidly. Some blamed age. Others whispered of poison. But Atossa knew. It was not poison in his blood. It was disappointment in his soul. He had built the most organized state the world had ever seen. He had created justice where chaos once ruled. But in the end, he was consumed by a single wound, a plain near Athens, where the empire had been humbled by freedom. Atossa stood by him in his final days. No longer queen, not yet dowager. She was simply a wife. She read to him the inscriptions he had written. She reminded him of the temples rebuilt, the satrapies at peace, the children educated, the cities that now stood where wilderness once roamed. She did not mention Marathon. He died in silence, with the sun rising over the eastern windows of Persepolis. The funeral was grand, befitting a king of kings. But Atossa's mourning was private. She did not tear her robes or wail. She stood at the head of the procession, not as a widow, but as a guardian of legacy. Xerxes now stood where Darius once had. And behind him, as always, was Atossa. The war with Greece would continue. But she had already begun the next campaign, one not of conquest but of endurance. Because empires are not remembered for the battles they win. They are remembered for what they survive. The throne room of Persepolis had changed, though its columns still reached to the heavens and its walls still bore the carvings of tribute-bearing nations. Where once Darius had stood with the weight of empire at his back, now Xerxes stood, younger, taller, but with the same fire smoldering beneath his brow. And behind him, as she had stood behind his father, Atossa watched, not as a relic of the past, but as the force that had shaped the present. Her son was king, but it was her hand that had guided him to that summit. In the months after Darius's death, the empire entered a quiet period of consolidation. There were no rebellions, no dramatic upheavals, no cries of succession dispute, an anomaly in the history of dynastic transitions. That stability had not come by chance. It had been built stone by stone, whisper by whisper, through decades of careful positioning and invisible alliances. Atossa had begun long before Darius had named Xerxes as heir. She had understood that the empire, vast and multicultural, did not recognize bloodline alone. Legitimacy required consensus, from satraps, from nobles, from generals, and most critically, from the temple fires where Ahura Mazda's will was invoked. To build such consensus, she had moved with patience and precision. While other consorts had sought favor through spectacle, Atossa had worked in silence. She had married her daughters into families of influence. She had sponsored the careers of scribes and court officials who would later shape narratives and deliver reports to the throne. She had paid tribute not with gold, but with protection, offering favors when needed, extending mercy where others demanded punishment. She had never claimed power. She had simply become essential to it. And now, with Xerxes seated on the throne, she turned her gaze inward, not for rest, but for defense. The court was watching. Rivals had not vanished. They had only grown quieter, waiting for weakness to bloom in the new reign. And Atossa would not allow that. She began by reaffirming alliances. The satraps who had once backed other sons of Darius were invited to Persepolis, not for judgment, but for recognition. They were given new roles, new honors, new responsibilities that reinforced their place in the imperial structure. Their loyalty was not demanded. It was absorbed. At the same time, she strengthened the inner court. The wives of key generals were brought under her care. The children of provincial elites were invited to train in Susa and learn alongside her grandchildren. The palace became not just a place of administration, but of indoctrination, a subtle schooling in loyalty. But her most delicate maneuvering took place in the harem. There, among the silken partitions and perfumed gardens, politics flourished like vines, quiet, beautiful, and often deadly. The wives of Darius, who still lived now, resided in the shadows of Atossa's elevation. Some harbored resentment, others bitterness. Their sons, though passed over for succession, remained princes with ambition. Atossa did not confront them. She embraced them. She organized festivals that honored their lineages. She appointed their daughters to serve in temple stewardships. She commissioned paintings of the royal family that included their likenesses, ensuring that no one felt erased. In doing so, she transformed potential threats into participants, stakeholders in a legacy that was no longer contested. She also worked to elevate Xerxes' image. Though now king, he lacked his father's decades of experience. Many in the court still saw him as the boy who had studied in libraries while others rode in campaigns. Atossa moved quickly to change that perception. She encouraged public audiences in which Xerxes received tributes, ruled on disputes, and delivered judgments with measured confidence. She ensured that his proclamations were written in authoritative tones, referencing not only Darius but Cyrus, tracing a lineage of power that now culminated in him. She reminded her son, always in private, that kingship was not inherited. It was confirmed each day in 1,000 silent acts. But even as she built his strength, she prepared for his autonomy. Atossa knew she could not remain at the center forever. Her role as queenmaker had reached its zenith, and now she had to transition into something subtler. The voice of memory, the conscience of power. She withdrew from the daily operations of court, allowing Xerxes to forge his own patterns. She refused to speak in council unless asked. She declined to overrule decisions, even when she disagreed. In doing so, she created space not for her absence but for her evolution. The empire noticed. Her name was spoken with reverence, no longer simply as the Queen of Queens, but as the Mother of Empire. She became a symbol of continuity, wisdom, and restrained authority. Her portrait, once confined to private chambers, was now painted on palace walls. Always seated, always still, always watching. And yet, in her silence, she continued to shape. When Xerxes debated how to respond to renewed provocations from Greece, it was Atossa who brought him the scrolls of his father's campaigns, not to persuade but to inform. She laid before him the ledgers of Marathon, the logistics, the maps, the names of the dead. She did not counsel for peace or war. She simply reminded him, victory is never an answer. It is a question postponed. Xerxes listened as Darius had once listened, but he also made his own path. He ordered new shipyards to be constructed. He called for the assembly of an army larger than any Persia had ever fielded. He announced his intention to complete what his father had begun. Atossa did not object. She had never believed that empires could avoid war, but she believed they could survive it if their core remained intact. And so, as the court shifted once more toward preparations for invasion, she returned to her old patterns. Strengthening bonds, ensuring cohesion, fortifying the empire's interior while its edges burned. In quiet moments, she walked the terraces of Persepolis, watching the sun rise over the stone reliefs that told the story of submission, unity, and law. She watched the artisans restore the carvings faded by time. She saw children playing in the shadows of columns taller than trees. And she thought not of Xerxes or Darius or even Cyrus. She thought of the empire, not as a place but as an idea she had shaped not through speeches or battles, but through patience, clarity, and conviction. Atossa had been queen. She had been mother. Now she was memory, and from that place she would continue to guide. The empire Darius had built did not die with him. Its roads still stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. Its satraps still bowed their heads in solemn tribute, and its temples still burned with the fire of Ahura Mazda. But the rhythms had changed. Where once decisions moved with the precision of a commander's call, now they pulsed with the cautious deliberation of a new king learning the weight of his own voice. Xerxes, still young by the reckoning of monarchs, had inherited more than an empire. He had inherited a precedent, a legend, and an expectation to finish what had been left incomplete. Atossa, now stepping fully into the role of Queen Mother, watched with eyes shaped by decades of consequence. She had been beside Darius as he aged, not just in body, but in burden. She had seen how time wore down the certainty of kings. In the twilight of his reign, Darius had spoken less of expansion and more of endurance. He had begun to view conquest not as glory, but as risk. His vision had grown heavy with the cost of maintaining what had once been won with fire. In those last years, Atossa became more than a consort. She was his steward, his historian, his filter between memory and myth. He would sit beneath the painted ceilings of Persepolis, stroking the inscriptions he himself had commissioned, and whisper to her about what had been achieved and what had not. The name Marathon passed through his lips less like a curse and more like an unanswered riddle. Atossa did not offer comfort. She offered perspective. "You ruled a world, not a battle," she had told him once, as he stared into the blue shadows of a winter morning. "A single defeat cannot erase the balance you restored." Yet even she knew that he did not believe it. He had come to power by right of claim and force of will, but he had maintained power through precision. His reforms had bound the empire in a net of law and ritual. His taxes fed cities and armies, and his structures enabled peace to feel like permanence. But as the years wore on, his hands began to tremble, his steps slowed, and the world he had shaped with such clarity began to slip beneath him. The court, sensing the shift, began to pivot. Younger officials aligned themselves with Xerxes. Older ones retired or were replaced. Military commanders, once loyal to Darius's command style, now whispered strategies designed to appeal to the new king's ambition. And through it all, Atossa mediated, not with proclamations, but with presence. She reminded the old guard of their legacy, and the new of their responsibility. She ensured that the transition would be evolution, not rupture. Darius's death, though anticipated, still felt like the loss of a continent. He had died not on a battlefield, nor in the midst of a grand ceremony, but in a quiet chamber, surrounded by the silence of twilight. Atossa held his hand, though she knew he was no longer fully present. His thoughts had drifted somewhere far beyond the reach of voices, into the realm of kings who wonder if their crowns will outlive their breath. His body was embalmed and entombed at Nakshi Rustam, in a rock-cut tomb carved high above the plain. Its walls bore inscriptions in 3 languages, proclaiming his justice, his lineage, his devotion to Ahura Mazda. But none of the words could capture the stillness that followed. The funeral was immense. Satraps and envoys from every corner of the empire marched in solemn procession. Rituals were performed not only in Zoroastrian fire temples, but in the local shrines of subject peoples. For all his power, Darius had left behind not terror, but order, and in that, he had transcended the definition of a conqueror. Xerxes now stood alone, though never unobserved. Atossa watched him carefully in the first months of his reign as sovereign. The crown, once ceremonial, now sat heavy on his brow. The deference of others was no longer a courtesy, it was an expectation. Decisions that had once been suggested now required finality. There were no more mentors, no more shadows to follow, only a throne and a world that waited. She offered him guidance, not directives. She reminded him of Darius's early missteps, not to sow doubt, but to normalize error. She encouraged him to listen before acting, to travel before judging, to question not just the reports of generals, but the motives behind them. She emphasized patience, not as hesitation but as control. Xerxes learned quickly. He spoke rarely in council, but when he did, his words carried clarity. He dismissed flatterers, elevated seasoned administrators, and spent his first year consolidating, mapping the empire not with ambition but with stewardship. Atossa was pleased. He had resisted the impulse to leap forward, choosing instead to understand the terrain beneath him. But the memory of Marathon lingered. The court still debated retribution. The military still called for justice. And the people, whose children had bled on distant shores, demanded that the balance be restored. Xerxes listened to all, but in the silence that followed those clamorings, it was Atossa's voice that lingered loudest. She did not tell him what to do. She simply reminded him that no king was ever defeated by an enemy before he was defeated by his own empire. "Secure your house," she said. "Then open your gates." And so, Xerxes turned inward once more. He reformed the tribute system, adjusting for population changes and agricultural shifts. He invested in repairing temples damaged by weather and neglect. He extended support to the priesthoods not only of Zoroastrian fire temples, but also to Babylonian, Egyptian, and Anatolian sanctuaries. He sent grain to drought-stricken provinces, forgave tax debt in earthquake-ravaged lands, and reaffirmed the unity of the realm. Atossa watched with cautious pride. But she knew what came next. War, like winter, does not wait forever. The provocations resumed. Greek city-states aiding revolts in Western Asia Minor, attacking trade vessels, refusing emissaries. The calls for vengeance grew sharper, and Xerxes, now a king in full command of his title, made the decision. He would go to war, this time not just to punish, but to conquer. The campaign would be unlike any before. Hundreds of thousands would march. Bridges would be built across seas. A canal would be dug through Athos. The gods of Greece would be challenged not just by soldiers but by scale. And Atossa, though no longer young, prepared the empire for what would follow. She ensured that the imperial court remained strong in Xerxes's absence. She gathered scribes to record every detail of the campaign, not just for glory, but for learning. She created councils that could adapt to shifting politics in his absence, and she appointed guardians to the crown should tragedy occur. She understood the fragility of power in motion. She did not oppose the war. She opposed weakness, and weakness came not from failure, but from failing to prepare. In private, she met with Xerxes before his departure. She blessed him not as a mother, but as a sovereign. She reminded him of the weight he carried, not just as a warrior, but as the living continuation of a vision they had spent their lives creating. He bowed to her not as a son, but as a king to his queen. Then he left, and Atossa remained. She had outlived a father who had founded an empire, a brother who had nearly lost it, a husband who had rebuilt it, and now stood behind a son who sought to define it anew. Time had not claimed her. It had sharpened her. She walked now through quieter halls, among younger faces, beneath banners that still bore the sigils of Cyrus, Darius, and Ahura Mazda. She spoke less. She observed more. But her presence continued to stitch the empire's many hearts into a single rhythm. When kings grow old, the empire must remember. And as long as Atossa lived, it would. The departure of Xerxes from Susa was not marked by silence. It was a march of measured thunder, the sound of soldiers' sandals pounding the earth, the groan of carts loaded with weapons and grain, the banners of 100 peoples fluttering in the desert sun. He did not ride out in haste or secrecy. This was not a raid or a campaign. This was spectacle, a deliberate display of imperial inevitability. But behind the trumpet calls and the polished armor, behind the gold-threaded tunics and the chanting priests, there was a weight heavier than steel, the eyes of Atossa. She stood upon the high terrace of the palace, unmoving as Xerxes passed beneath. Their gazes met only briefly. He was armored, helmet under one arm, his face unreadable. She wore no crown, no jewels, only the simple white robes of a queen mother in vigil. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. Everything had already been said, long before the ships were built and the bridges dreamed. As the armies disappeared beyond the horizon, Atossa turned inward. This time, she did not retreat as she had once done, in her husband's final years, when her work as a queen seemed fulfilled. Now she returned to the core not in grief, but in purpose. The empire still breathed, its lungs vast, its blood flowing in tribute and grain, its brain scattered across satrapal councils. And she would keep it breathing while her son gambled the crown in the mountains and seas of Hellas. She began with the court. In Xerxes' absence, it would become the beating heart of stability or its rupture. Atossa ensured that the Regency Council, formally convened under Xerxes' name, was composed not only of loyal men, but of thoughtful ones. She appointed administrators from regions far from the capital, balancing Persian nobility with Babylonian clerics, Elamite scribes, and Median generals. This was not kindness, it was insulation. If one faction fell, the others would hold. She placed women in roles that had once been ceremonial and made them strategic. The wives of satraps became envoys. The mothers of military commanders became liaisons. Information flowed not only through messengers, but through meals, rituals, and correspondence wrapped in silk and incense. The empire, for all its might, had always been a matter of understanding the spaces between proclamations. Atossa knew every one of those spaces. In temples, she reinforced the rhythms of worship. Fire temples were resupplied with oil and sacred wood. Zoroastrian rites were performed with greater frequency, their chants echoing through the empire's soul. She knew that in times of uncertainty, ritual was a shelter more powerful than law. The people did not yet feel war, but they felt the distance of their king. And in that distance, Atossa became his shadow. She responded to letters from satraps in Xerxes' name, her tone measured, her wording careful to imitate his. She corrected logistical delays without fanfare, always ensuring that credit returned to the crown. She became the unseen continuity between absence and presence. But war has a rhythm all its own. News arrived slowly at first, landfall in Thrace, safe passage across the Hellespont, the construction of the bridge of boats. Then came victories. Cities surrendered. Greek factions submitted. The empire's reach had extended once more, and Xerxes stood in the ruins of temples that had once mocked his father's defeat. But Atossa did not celebrate. She knew well how quickly tides turned. She knew that terrain meant more than territory, that mountains could devour armies, that alliances could dissolve with a whisper. She read between the lines of every report. She measured the absence of names, the quiet revisions of tone, the subtle hesitations in the hands of the scribes. Then came the news of Salamis, the great fleet, built over years, designed by the most skilled artisans of Phoenicia and Egypt, had been drawn into narrow waters. The Greek ships, smaller but faster, had struck like wolves among oxen. The Persian navy, cornered and confused, had fractured. Fire consumed hulls. Commanders drowned. And Xerxes, for all his preparation, had watched from a golden throne upon a cliff. The defeat was not only tactical, it was psychological. And though Xerxes survived, Returning by land to continue the campaign from a distance, Atossa felt the fracture echo through the empire. Panic did not follow. Not yet. The satrapies remained loyal. The tributes still flowed. But the illusion of invulnerability, carefully rebuilt after Marathon, had shattered again. The West, once a stubborn frontier, had become a wound that would not close. Atossa responded not with decrees but with silence. She convened no public assemblies. She issued no proclamations of vengeance or reassurance. Instead, she focused on the interior. Granaries were inspected, trade routes fortified, taxes adjusted to relieve pressure on drought-stricken provinces. She moved through the empire like a surgeon, subtle, precise, cutting only where necessary. And she turned her attention to the children. Xerxes' sons were now of age, living within the palace complex. Atossa began their training not in swordplay, but in observation. She taught them the history of the empire not as a list of battles, but as a map of mistakes. She introduced them to scribes and satraps, letting them learn the faces behind decisions. She reminded them that rule was not performance, but continuity. She did not raise heirs. She raised successors, and all the while she waited. She waited for Xerxes to return, not as a warrior triumphant, but as a king tempered. When he finally did, his face was changed. Not aged, not broken, but hardened. The war was not over, but he had seen its cost. He had seen friends fall, supply lines fracture, and the limits of numbers tested by terrain and spirit. He had seen what his father had seen, what Atossa had always known. The empire could not be everywhere, could only be itself. He arrived without procession. He spoke little. He retreated to his chambers and summoned his mother. Their meeting was unrecorded. No scribe transcribed it. No servant lingered near. But what emerged was not regret. It was clarity. In the months that followed, Xerxes shifted course. He did not abandon the Greek campaign, but he redefined its goals. Garrisons were withdrawn from exposed positions. Tribute replaced conquest. The war became a border, not an expansion. And Atossa once more stepped back. Her work was complete, not because the empire was safe, but because it could now survive without her. She spent her final years in the high gardens of Persepolis, where the air smelled of stone warmed by sun and the wind carried the scents of lilies and cedar. She read the records of her youth. She walked the walls of her father's palace. She listened to children laugh among the columns. She received visitors rarely. Those who came found her seated, not in grandeur, but in stillness. Her eyes, once sharp with calculation, now softened with the kind of wisdom that can only come from seeing an empire rise, fall, and rise again. She did not write a memoir. She did not commission monuments. She left no final edict, because the story was already written. Etched into the laws of satrapies, the flames of fire temples, the memories of two kings, and the breath of every citizen who walked roads she had once helped pave. She had been a daughter of empire, a wife of power, a mother of kings, and when she finally closed her eyes, the empire did not tremble. It breathed. The death of Atossa passed quietly through the empire, not because it was unnoticed, but because the echo of her presence had long since been woven into the walls of palaces and the ink of imperial edicts. There was no great mourning procession, no formal canonization. No golden effigy was paraded through the streets. Instead, the empire continued, unchanged in its rhythm, unshaken in its order. That, in itself, was her epitaph. She had passed in the upper chambers of Persepolis, surrounded by her handmaidens and the soft murmur of a summer wind drifting through stone lattice. No grand declarations were issued. No priests proclaimed omens. Her son, Xerxes, received the news without weeping, and the court did not dissolve into spectacle. Because to mourn Atossa publicly would have been redundant. Her life had not been built on attention, but on endurance. In the days following her death, there was a stillness in the palace. Not emptiness, but a quiet recalibration. The Queen Mother had long ceased to rule in name, but her presence had lingered in every corridor, every council, every decision. With her gone, it became evident how often people had adjusted their thoughts, their tone, their ambitions in anticipation of her gaze, even if she was not present. Now, they moved freely, and for some, that freedom felt like disorientation. But the empire did not falter. It was held in place by the very structures she had nurtured, an architecture of law, ritual, memory, and trust. Roads still bore cargo across mountains. Fire temples still burned with holy flame. Satraps still submitted tribute. Scribes still copied laws. The balance she had maintained was no longer dependent on her hands. It was institutionalized, internalized, unshakable. In Babylon, her passing was marked by a quiet ceremony in a temple she had once saved from defunding. In Susa, merchants offered food to the poor in her name, remembering the years she had lowered taxes during a drought. In Sardis, a minor official wept at his writing desk, recalling the time she had intervened to save his daughter from an unjust marriage. None of these gestures were ordered. None of them publicized. They happened like wind shifting the surface of water, gentle, wide-reaching, impossible to trace to a single point of origin. At Nakshi Rustam, where the tombs of kings loomed above the desert, her burial site was carved near that of Darius. Not in the shape of power, but in the echo of legacy. A modest chamber, adorned not with scenes of conquest, but with symbols of continuity. Scrolls, fire altars, branches of the sacred Halma. A tomb that spoke not of triumphs, but of preservation. Xerxes visited the site alone. No retinue, no fanfare, only a quiet walk beneath the sun that had once warmed his mother's shoulders as she paced the royal terraces. He stood at the entrance to the tomb and did not speak. He did not need to. Everything he ruled had once passed through her judgment. Every decision he would make would unfold along the pathways she had laid. In the years that followed, Xerxes would face challenges. Wars, assassinations, revolts. He would taste both victory and defeat. But through it all, he would remain tethered, not to the image of a god-king, but to the model his mother had offered: resilience without arrogance, clarity without noise, endurance without spectacle. The empire, too, would survive. Not forever, as no empire does, but for generations. It would pass through hands less capable, endure storms more violent, and face rivals more cunning. But its essence, its structure, would endure far beyond its founders. Not because of any one battle or any single law, but because of the invisible threads that held it together. Threads spun by a woman who had never sought power, only stability. In modern retellings, she is often a footnote, consort, a mother, a name in the long chain of royal blood. But history's gaze, when sharpened, reveals her true shape, the quiet force behind one of the world's greatest empires. Not a conqueror, not a martyr, but a steward of permanence. Atossa had lived through 5 reigns. She had survived palace coups, foreign wars, and internal schisms. She had seen the world remade through blood and rebuilt through law. And in each moment of crisis, she had not rushed forward. She had waited, assessed, moved when it mattered. Her power was not spectacle, it was consequence. Now she was gone, but the roads still stretched across deserts. The scrolls still whispered her logic in ink. The fires still burned, and the empire still breathed.